The story begins on the glittering shores of Banana Island, a place where the rich lived in mansions so large they seemed carved out of clouds themselves, where the gates were higher than the palms, and the walls gleamed like marble teeth against the salt air of the Atlantic. But beneath all that wealth, whispers lingered in the marketplace. Whispers carried from mouth to ear like restless spirits. They said one house in particular, taller, whiter, more silent than the rest, was cursed. It devoured the men who worked there, chewing up their pride, spitting out their souls, until not even their shadows wanted to follow them home. The people said the curse did not come from spirits or gods, but from the master of the house himself. Chief Oba, a man who walked in polished shoes but carried thunder in his voice and venom in his eyes. Those who lasted even a season under him returned to their villages broken, trembling at the sound of doors creaking, forever haunted by the memory of a man who demanded obedience but knew no mercy. And yet, in this very same house, a new servant had arrived, carrying on his shoulders a kind of hope that only poverty breeds, and in his chest the stubborn heart of one who refused to kneel before despair. His name was Namdi. Namdi came to the mansion with nothing but a black nylon bag slung across his back, its zipper half broken, the corners frayed, and in it only 2 shirts, a single pair of worn trousers, and a fading photograph of his father lying in bed with tired eyes. His father's illness was the anchor that had dragged him to this cursed house. Medicine cost money, and money in Lagos flowed only toward those who could survive its harsh demands. When Namdi first set his eyes on the mansion, he paused at the gates, staring at the lion-shaped handles that seemed to glare back at him as if warning him to turn away. But hunger is stronger than fear, and duty heavier than superstition. With trembling steps, he entered a house that no man had yet conquered. The mansion smelled of polish and silence. Every corner gleamed as if it had been scrubbed by invisible hands. The marble floor reflected the afternoon light, like still water, and the chandeliers above sparkled like a frozen storm. It was beautiful, yes, but it was not alive. It was a kind of beauty that smothered instead of welcomed, the kind that felt more like a coffin than a home. And there, standing at the top of the staircase, dressed in a spotless white agbada that shimmered like the scales of a serpent, was Chief Oba himself. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself with such authority that even his silence cracked like a whip. His skin shone with wealth, his eyes glinted like razors, and his mouth curved into a smile that was more of a threat than a greeting. "So," he said, his voice deep and sharp, echoing against the marble walls, "this is the boy they brought me?" Another week back, another trembling pair of hands that will fail before the moon turns twice. Namdi bowed his head, though his heart thudded like a drum of war inside his chest. "Yes, sir," he whispered. "I have come to work. I will not fail." Chief Oba's laugh was short, without warmth. They all say that. They come crawling from the gutters of the city, clutching their bellies, promising strength. But the house knows their hearts, and he spread his hands as if showing scars invisible to the world. "I know their limits. You will break. Boy, they always do. But until then, shine my floors, polish my silver, wash my sins from the windows if you can." And with that, he turned, his agbada swaying like the wings of a predator, leaving Namdi standing there, not sure whether to breathe or to vanish. The other servants avoided his eyes. In the kitchen, they moved like ghosts, their conversations clipped, their laughter strangled in their throats. A pot clanged too loudly, and a boy nearly fainted with fear. They whispered in corners, warning Namdi with quick, darting looks. Do not answer back. Do not look him in the eye. Do not cough when he eats. Do not exist more than necessary. But Namdi only nodded, saying nothing, for inside it was not fear, but stubborn fire. He thought of his father lying in bed, coughing through the night, of his younger siblings who shared a single plate of beans among themselves, of the village elders who said he was the family's last hope. He could not break. Not here, not now. That first night, as Namdi lay on a thin mattress provided for servants, the mansion groaned as if alive. The wind outside rattled the windows, and from somewhere deep within the walls, he swore he heard a sound, like a man's sob strangled into silence. He turned, clutching the fading photograph of his father, whispering a prayer to the ancestors. "Give me strength. Let me endure this lion's den." Sleep came to him slowly, like a thief testing the lock on a door. Days turned into weeks, and the mansion tested him in ways he had not imagined. Floors that had already been scrubbed still seemed dirty in Oba's eyes. Plates polished until they shone still carried invisible stains according to his harsh judgment. A single speck of dust on the window sill could earn a glare that froze Namdi's bones. But he endured, his jaw tight, his spirit unbent. He began to notice things others missed. How Oba's eyes lingered too long on the horizon when storms gathered over the ocean. How his hand trembled ever so slightly when he poured his evening wine. How the man who roared like thunder at day's end often stood alone in the shadows of the great hall, staring at nothing. The whispers of the marketplace had not lied. Chief Oba was more than cruel. He was haunted, and the house itself seemed to amplify his torment. Mirrors cracked without cause, doors slammed in the absence of wind, and servants swore that sometimes, in the dead of night, they saw the silhouette of a man kneeling in the courtyard, though no one dare confirm if it was Oba himself. And so the stage was set, the mansion, the lion, and the boy who had dared to enter its jaws. The people outside called it curse. The servants inside called it prison. But Namdi, clutching his fading photograph night after night, called it something else, a trial. And in every folk tale, trials lead to legends, if the hero does not shatter first. The days in Chief Oba's mansion unfolded like endless seasons of drought, parched, suffocating, and merciless, each hour stretching into a battlefield where survival demanded silence, obedience, and a heart stronger than stone. For Namdi, the mansion had quickly revealed itself to be no ordinary place of service, but rather a living beast, a house with hungry walls and restless shadows, a palace that seemed to test every man who dared to sweep its marble floors or polish its towering windows. By dawn, he rose before the first call of the muezzin echoed from the far side of Lagos, his tired hands gripping the broom as though it were a spear, his eyes half shut, but his spirit unwilling to surrender. He scrubbed the endless tiled corridors until his palms blistered and bled, carried water from cisterns that seemed to refill themselves by some cursed law, and polished Oba's imported cars until he could see his weary reflection staring back, hollow-eyed and questioning how much longer he could endure. Yet still he pressed on, for each drop of sweat was not only for the tyrant under whose roof he toiled, but for his father lying weak and coughing in their small, mud-walled home, waiting for medicine that only Namdi's endurance could buy. The other servants, gaunt men whose backs were bent like yam stalks in the wind, spoke to him in hushed whispers when Chief Oba was not near, their words trembling with both pity and warning. "Young one," murmured Ikenna, the old cook whose eyes carried the weary fog of many years, "this house devours men. It swallows them whole. Look at me. Once I was proud, with laughter in my chest. Now I have none left, for this master takes it away with every order, every lash of his tongue. You are new, and you still carry fire. But beware, the fire will not last here." And another, Chikwudi, the gardener whose hands were hardened from the soil, leaned close one evening while the moon hid behind torn clouds and whispered, "They say no servant has ever lasted long in this mansion. Men leave broken. Some vanish into the night, and some," his voice dropped to a hush, "lose their minds. The master's anger is not just flesh and blood. It is something darker, a storm that the ancestors themselves cannot tame." Namdi listened, his chest tightening with both fear and defiance, but he told himself he had not come here to bow to stories. He had come to endure, to win, to carry his family's burden on his narrow shoulders until it broke or until he did. Chief Oba's fury was a storm that never needed reason. The mansion trembled when his voice rose, like thunder rolling through the hollow chest of the sky. Sometimes it was a misplaced glass, sometimes a wrinkle in the tablecloth, sometimes nothing at all, just his eyes catching the face of a servant and finding fault where none existed. Namdi learned quickly that his very presence was enough to provoke lightning. Oba would summon him with a clap of his jeweled fingers, his silk robes trailing like the wings of a hawk, his face carved into arrogance. "Boy," he would hiss, his words sharp as knives, "you walk too slow, as if time belongs to you. You are in my house. Here, time belongs to me." And he would strike the cane across Namdi's back, not out of necessity, but out of the cruel rhythm of habit. The pain burned, but Namdi gritted his teeth, refusing to cry. for the cry would be give Oba what he wanted, a display of brokenness. And so he endured, silently carrying the bruises like invisible tattoos, each mark a testament to his stubborn refusal to yield. But cruelty has a way of growing teeth, and the night of the dinner party was when Oba bared them all. It was a grand affair, with wealthy men and women flooding the mansion like a tide of gold and perfume. Laughter echoed in the halls, wine flowed like rivers, and the chandeliers blazed brighter than the stars outside. For the servants, it was a night of terror, for every movement was watched, every mistake punished. Namdi carried trays heavy with roasted goat and steaming jollof rice, his arms trembling under the weight, his eyes fixed on the polished floor to avoid Oba's gaze. But fate is a cruel trickster, and as he passed near the head of the long table, one trembling hand slipped just slightly, tilting the tray so that a drop of wine fell onto the white sleeve of Oba's guest, a wealthy politician whose laughter froze into silence. The room fell quiet as the grave, all eyes turning toward Namdi, as though he had spilled blood rather than wine. Chief Oba rose slowly, his face unreadable at first, but his eyes glowed with fire. "Come here," he said softly, too softly. Namdi obeyed, his knees weak, his throat dry as desert wind. And then the storm broke. Oba struck him across the face with the back of his hand, the sound cracking through the hall like thunder. Gasps filled the room, but no one dared intervene. "You disgrace me before my guests? You think yourself a man fit to serve in my house?" Oba roared, his voice drowning even the music. And before them all, before the politicians and merchants and wives dressed in jewels, Oba forced Namdi to kneel, to beg forgiveness, to wipe the stain from the guest's sleeve with his own shirt. The humiliation burned hotter than any whip, hotter than any flame. That night, when the guests had gone and the mansion returned to silence, Namdi lay awake on the cold floor of the servants' quarters, his heart pounding with rage, shame, and something else, a seed of defiance that had been buried but was now beginning to grow. Yet, even as despair gnawed at him, the mansion itself seemed to change. The air grew heavier, the shadows stretched longer, and the mirrors in the corridor seemed to shiver, as if holding secrets they wished to reveal. When Oba raged, the winds outside rose as though the skies themselves echoed his fury. When he grew silent, the house seemed to hold its breath, as if awaiting the next strike. Some whispered that Oba's cruelty was not entirely his own, that he carried a wound too deep for men to see, a wound that poisoned not only his soul, but the very air around him. Namdi did not know whether to believe such whispers, but he felt them tightening around him like a net, pulling him into a tale far older and darker than the wealth of Banana Island. He began to wonder whether he was merely a servant or the pawn of some larger story, some ancient curse that lived within the mansion's golden walls. And though exhaustion bent his back, though fear gnawed at his resolve, he clenched his fists in the dark and swore that he would not break. Not here, not now. For somewhere beyond the cruelty, beyond the storms, there had to be an answer, and perhaps, though he did not yet know it, he would be the one to find it. The night came down heavy over Banana Island, a night thicker than any that had passed since Namdi first stepped into the mansion of Chief Oba. The sea breeze was restless, rattling the gates and stirring the palm leaves into whispering choirs of unease, as though the island itself wished to remind the great chief that wealth could not purchase peace. Inside, the chandeliers burned low, casting more shadow than light across the marble floors, and in that dimness the walls seemed to breathe like the chest of some slumbering beast. Namdi had learned by now to move in silence when the darkness fell, for Chief Oba's mood could turn sharper than a blade if he sensed eyes upon him. Yet on this particular night, as Namdi crossed the corridor to clear away the dishes from the master's late meal, a sound halted his steps. Something raw, something unfamiliar. It was not the roar of command, not the cutting laughter of authority, but the sound of a man breaking, the kind of sobs that clawed from the belly of a wounded animal. He froze, his heart pounding against his ribs, for he had never heard Chief Oba weep, and the idea of it seemed as unnatural as the moon bleeding in the sky. Namdi, against every instinct, moved closer. His bare feet barely brushed the tiles, his breath shallow as he approached the half-open door at the far end of the corridor. The forbidden room, the one no servant dared enter without summons. The weeping came from within, broken, jagged, the sound of chains rattling around a spirit that had long hidden its wounds. He pushed the door wider, and his eyes fell upon a sight he would never forget. Chief Oba, dressed not in silks, but in a simple white wrapper, kneeling before an old cracked mirror. The mirror's frame was gilded but tarnished, and in its fractured surface the mighty man appeared multiplied into countless broken versions of himself. Faces distorted, eyes hollow, each shard reflecting a ghost of grief. His shoulders shook with the force of his sorrow, and in his hands he clutched a faded photograph, its edges worn thin, its image nearly erased by the years. Oba's forehead pressed against the floor as his voice rose in a hoarse chant, begging forgiveness from shadows no one else could see. The mansion that swallowed men whole, the palace that glittered with cruelty, trembled quietly with the sound of its master's weakness. Namdi's throat tightened, for here was a lion undone, the tyrant unmasked, a man of flesh and fear after all. He wanted to retreat, to pretend he had not witnessed this moment, but his legs betrayed him and carried him into the chamber. The air was cold as a grave, and yet his feet fell hot upon the rug as if stepping upon sacred ground. He set the tray down softly by the wall, and though he tried to move back, Oba had already sensed him. The chief's head lifted sharply, eyes red, face streaked with tears that glistened like the salt of the sea. For a long and dangerous moment, silence crackled between them, silence that could end with a blade to Namdi's throat. But instead of rage, Oba's lips trembled with a confession he had never meant to speak aloud. "Do you see now?" he whispered, his voice thin as a dying flame. "Do you see what I am beneath all this gold? A man cursed by his own blood, betrayed by kin, left hollow by love." His hand shook as he raised the photograph toward the boy. "She left me, Namdi. She left me when I had nothing, and when I returned with everything, she would not look at me. I built this house to prove myself, but it has become my prison. And these servants, they are only my chains." The weight of his words pressed on Namdi's chest heavier than stone, for he had never imagined the master's cruelty to be born from grief. He had thought Oba only a monster, carved from iron, forged in fire, incapable of fracture. Yet here was the truth, raw and jagged. A man gnawed by abandonment, striking out at the world because he could not heal the wound within. For the first time, pity fought with fear in Namdi's heart. He stepped closer, not as servant and master, but as man to man, his voice low, almost trembling. "Chief, I cannot pretend to know your pain, but I know that building walls of anger will not silence the ghosts. You carry them with you wherever you go." The boldness of the words shocked him even as they left his mouth, and he waited for the blow, for the command that would end his life. But Chief Oba only stared at him, his breathing ragged, his eyes searching the boy's face for mockery or falsehood. Finding none, he lowered his head again, a long exhale shuddering through him as though the mansion itself sighed. And in that instant, something shifted, not only in the man but in the house itself. The chandeliers flickered, their light flaring brighter for a moment, chasing shadows back into corners. The wind outside stilled, as if the island held its breath. From the courtyard, a bird cried, a sound Namdi had not heard since his first day, for the birds had long abandoned his state silence. It was as if nature itself recognized the crack in the chief's armor, as if the world leaned forward to listen to this fragile opening. Namdi stood still, his pulse racing, but deep inside, a fire of courage sparked. Perhaps the mansion was not only cursed. Perhaps it waited, hungry for a truth long denied. Perhaps Chief Oba, for all his cruelty, still carried the seed of change buried beneath years of ash. When Oba finally spoke again, his voice was low, weary, stripped of thunder. "You should not have seen this, boy," he said, though without venom. "But perhaps you were meant to. Perhaps the God sent you here, not to serve me, but to remind me that I am still a man." He rose slowly to his feet, his frame towering but not invincible, his eyes heavy with unshed tears. He placed the photograph back into a carved wooden box, locking it away as though tucking his wound into the dark once more. Yet when he turned to Namdi, there was no whip in his hand, no command of dismissal, only a silence that carried the weight of unspoken trust. "Go," he murmured, "before I change my mind." And Namdi obeyed, his steps careful, his heart heavy yet strangely lifted, for he had seen behind the mask, and once a man's weakness is seen, his strength can no longer terrify in the same way. That night, Namdi lay awake on his mat, staring at the ceiling that seemed now less suffocating, less cruel. The mansion creaked and groaned, but the echoes sounded different. Less like the growl of a beast, more like the sighs of something tired, longing for rest. He thought of Oba's tears, of the photo held like a lifeline, and though fear still tightened his chest, compassion gnawed at him stronger. The chief was no longer only the monster whispers, but a broken man dressed in gold, lashing out because he feared his emptiness. And in the deep hours of that night, Namdi made a vow, not spoken but carved into the marrow of his bones. He would endure, not only for his father's medicine, but for something greater. He would stay, he would serve, and he would bear witness until the lion of Banana Island learned to rest. And so the Folktales' path shifted, and though storms still brewed on the horizon, the seed of change had been planted in the soil of sorrow. The days that followed Namdi's boldness were unlike any that had come before in the mansion of Chief Oba. For though the storm had not fully cleared, the wind had shifted ever so slightly. There was a silence in the air that was no longer suffocating, but heavy with the kind of expectation that keeps a village awake before the first rains. Chief Oba did not immediately change, no, for the leopard does not simply drop its spots overnight, but something in his eyes had softened, as though a part of him had been cracked open, revealing a bleeding truth beneath all the thunder and polished cruelty. He began to watch Namdi with an intensity that felt less like a hawk circling prey and more like an elder trying to study the courage of a younger man who would dare to answer back to fate itself. At first it unsettled Namdi, for he feared that the chief was plotting some punishment crueler than before. Yet day after day passed, and instead of more lashings or humiliations, Chief Oba's wrath seemed to hesitate like a lion that had been wounded and no longer wished to fight unless provoked. And the servants whispered again, this time not curses or doom, but a strange magic that might be unfolding between master and servant. But Namdi did not trust easily, for he had lived too long with the smell of hunger and the bite of rejection to believe that power could simply transform itself into kindness. He went about his duties still cautious, still bowing, still carrying water and polishing silver with the diligence of one who knew his very survival depended upon it. Yet even in his fear he noticed things that had never happened before. When he spilled a drop of palm oil in the kitchen, Chief Oba only looked at him and said nothing, where once he would have hurled curses. When Namdi's broom broke during sweeping, Oba fetched another and tossed it towards him without insult. These were small mercies, almost invisible gestures, but in a house where mercy had been starved out like smoke from an empty hut, they felt like miracles. And so a strange rhythm developed between them, with nights that stretched into long silences, where Oba sat in his grand chair staring at the flames, and Namdi lingered close by, saying nothing but listening with the stillness of one who knows the ground trembles before mountains shift. Then came the season of sickness. Namdi's father, old and bent as a palm trunk scarred by years of toil, fell gravely ill back in the village. The news reached him through a tattered letter delivered by his younger brother, who had walked barefoot for hours to bring it. The words bled sorrow, for the healer had said their father's breath was thinning like smoke, and without medicine too costly for poor men, he would be swallowed by the earth before the next full moon. Namdi read the letter beneath the dim lantern light, his heart pounding with helplessness, and though he tried to keep his tears hidden, Chief Oba, who sat nearby in the shadows, saw the tremor in his shoulders. At first Oba said nothing, only observed, his face unreadable as a carved mask. But when dawn broke and the servants gathered, it was whispered that Chief Oba had sent a messenger to Lagos with a heavy pouch of coins. And before the sun set again, medicine was already on its way to Namdi's village. The boy was stunned, unable to comprehend such generosity from a man who had once flayed his soul with cruelty. He fell to his knees, thanking him with trembling words. But Chief Oba only waved his hand as though dismissing a trivial matter, his voice gruff and distant. Do your work well, boy. That is enough payment. Yet Namdi saw, in the brief flicker of his eyes, the echo of a man trying to remember what it meant to care. Slowly, like a river carving stone, the mansion itself began to change. Where once the servants had walked with heads bowed, whispering of curses, they now began to speak with cautious laughter, as if some invisible chain had loosened. The corridors that always felt like the belly of a beast now carried the faint scent of life. The cooks hummed softly as they stirred their pots. The gardener dared to plant new flowers in the courtyard, and the guards at the gate found themselves greeting visitors without growling. Chief Oba remained a man of shadows and storms, but his outbursts grew fewer, his punishments less frequent, and his silences deeper, as though Namdi's presence had drawn out a part of him that even he no longer recognized. Yet even in this season of change, tension clung to the walls like smoke after fire. The people did not forget who Oba had been, for scars do not vanish because the hand that cut them chooses to rest. Many wondered if this gentleness was only a passing dream, a trick of the wind before the storm returned. Some believed that Oba was softening only because he sought to use Namdi for some hidden purpose, while others whispered that perhaps the boy had broken the curse of the house. Namdi himself did not know what to believe. He only knew that when he looked into Oba's eyes in those rare unguarded moments, he saw a man both fierce and wounded, a man battling ghosts that no sword could slay. And so he resolved to stay, to listen, to wait, though his heart still thudded with the fear that one wrong step could awaken the lion once more. And then one evening, as the sun bled red over the horizon, Chief Oba spoke words that none could have imagined. He summoned Namdi to the veranda where the ocean breeze carried the salt of distant waters, and there, without the weight of audience or servants, he asked a question in a voice stripped bare of its usual thunder. "Tell me, boy, do you think a man can change?" The words hung in the air like an axe above a tree, heavy and trembling. Namdi did not answer immediately, for he knew this was no ordinary question, but a plea wrapped in pride. He looked at Oba, the mighty chief, feared and respected, yet in that moment no greater than a man standing before the ruins of his own heart. And he replied with the calm of one who had tasted both hunger and hope, "A man can change, chief. But he must choose it, not for the world, not for his enemies, not even for his wealth. He must choose it for himself." Those words cut deeper than any whip, for Chief Oba flinched as though struck, his gaze drifting to the horizon where the waves swallowed the sun. He said nothing more that night. But his silence was different, no longer the silence of a ruler above his servant, but a man carrying the weight of a truth he could no longer ignore. And so the mansion waited. The servants waited. Namdi waited. For though the wind had shifted and the curse seemed to be unraveling, the question remained. Would Chief Oba truly step into this new path, or would he retreat into the claws of his old self once more? The answer, everyone knew, would either free the house forever or bind it in chains darker than before. The final days inside the mansion felt like the gathering of 1,000 storms waiting to split the sky. The air was too heavy, the silence too loud, and even the polished marble floors seemed to groan under the weight of secrets that had been buried for too long. Namdi moved through those vast corridors with his heart pounding louder than his footsteps, for he knew that Chief Oba had reached a breaking point. The master's face no longer carried the cruel sneer of power, but instead the haunted mask of a man who had wrestled with unseen demons for far too long. His voice, once sharp enough to cut the spirit of any servant, now trembled with something fragile, almost human. And though fear still sat in the bones of the household like an old ghost that refused to leave, something in the air hinted at a coming change, an unraveling of the chains that had bound everyone to this cursed palace of wealth and grief. It was not the usual kind of tension that announced another beating, another humiliation, or another storm of rage. This was different. This was the kind of tension that comes before mountains crumble, before kings fall to their knees, before the story takes the turn that will echo through the mouths of griots for generations. It happened on an evening that should have been ordinary, but was destined to be written in fire. The sun had dropped behind the lagoon, spilling red light across the tall glass windows, and the house was bathed in the color of blood and ending. Chief Oba summoned Namdi to the grand dining hall, a place that had hosted countless feasts of vanity, where guests had once raised their glasses in false laughter while servants trembled in corners. Now it was empty except for the long table, polished and waiting, and 2 chairs placed at opposite ends like rivals ready for battle. The master sat at one end, dressed not in his usual regal white caftan but in a plain dark robe, his head bowed as though the weight of the years had finally bent him. He gestured weakly for Namdi to sit across from him, and the boy obeyed, his hand shaking as he lowered himself onto the chair. For a long while neither spoke. Only the ticking of the golden wall clock filled the room, each second dropping like a drumbeat of fate. Then Chief Oba lifted his head, and in his eyes there was no thunder, no lightning, only rain. "This house," he said slowly, "is not cursed by spirits, Namdi. It is cursed by me." The words landed like stones thrown into still water, rippling through Namdi's soul. For months he had carried the terror of the mansion's cruelty, believing it to be a force greater than men, something woven by gods to punish the living. But here sat the master himself, confessing that the curse was nothing but the shadow of his own heart. Chief Oba's voice cracked as he spoke, and the truth spilled from him like a river breaking its dam. He told of betrayal, of a brother who had stolen his inheritance, of a wife who had turned her back and fled with another man, of nights spent clawing at the walls of loneliness, while wealth piled higher around him like useless stone. He had thought that cruelty would make him strong, that fear would guard him from ever being broken again, but instead it had turned his palace into a tomb and his servants into prisoners. "I built these walls so high to keep the world out," he whispered, his hands trembling on the table. "But in doing so, I buried myself alive." Namdi sat frozen, his heart pounding. He had expected fury, another command to bow lower, another punishment for daring to exist. Instead, he saw before him not a lion but a man, wounded, broken, desperate for release. The folktale truth revealed itself. Every tyrant is but a man who once feared pain more than death. The boy's chest burned with conflicting feelings, rage for the suffering he had endured, sorrow for the pain that had created such cruelty, and something deeper still, compassion. He leaned forward, his voice steady though his hands shook. "Chief," he said softly, "pain makes men into shadows if they let it. But even shadows can vanish when the light is strong enough." His words hung in the air like incantations, not just advice but the language of destiny. The old man's eyes widened, as if hearing something he had long forgotten, as if a door inside him had creaked open. For the first time in the house's long history, the master lowered his head before a servant and wept without shame. The weeping did not end in minutes. It poured out of him like the rains of a long season, soaking the silence of the house. And with every tear that touched the polished wood of the dining table, something unseen shifted in the walls themselves. The chandeliers swayed without wind, the mirrors ceased their trembling, and the heavy air began to lift. The servants, who had gathered secretly outside the hall, peered through the doors in awe. They had never seen Chief Oba bent, never seen him stripped of his thunder. Some covered their mouths. Others held each other's hands, for they knew they were witnessing the breaking of a spell that had ruled their lives for too long. The mansion itself seemed to exhale, as though the stone and marble had been holding its breath for years and could finally release it. Folktales say that when a tyrant's heart cracks, even the trees outside will lean closer to listen. And that night, the palms that lined Banana Island bent toward the mansion, as if in reverence. When the storm of his grief finally subsided, Chief Oba lifted his head. His face was swollen, his eyes red. But there was a strange light in his gaze, a softness that had never been there before. "I cannot undo the years," he said hoarsely. "I cannot return what I have stolen from you all, the dignity, the laughter, the peace. But if there is still a path forward, I ask you, Namdi, to walk it beside me." The boy felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders, not as chains, but as a mantle. In that moment, he was no longer just a servant. He was the keeper of a story, the witness of a transformation, the bridge between what had been broken and what might be rebuilt. He nodded slowly, his heart swelling with something greater than fear, greater even than forgiveness. It was the kind of purpose that makes legends, the kind of choice that outlives a man. In the days that followed, the mansion changed in ways that the people of Banana Island would whisper about for years. The cruel master who once barked orders now sat with his servants in the courtyard, sharing meals not as master and slave, but as men bound by the same breath of life. The corridors that once echoed with shouts now carried the sound of laughter, cautious at first, then bold as freedom. Namdi became the trusted hand of Chief Oba, not because of obedience, but because of the truth he had dared to speak. The other servants stood taller, their backs unbent, their eyes no longer cast to the ground. And those who had once sworn never to serve in that cursed house returned to see it with their own eyes, amazed at the rebirth. The mansion had been a prison, but now it had become a gathering place of healing, a symbol that even the darkest hearts can find light if shown compassion. But folk tales are not told only for their endings. They are carried so that every listener may remember the lesson that outlives the characters. And so it was said by griots beneath the moon, around fires where children leaned forward and elders nodded. On Banana Island there once lived a man who was feared more than the gods. But one poor boy, with nothing but a bag of hope and the courage to speak truth, melted the stone around his heart. And from that day, the lion of the mansion roared no more, for he had learned the power of tears. Namdi's name became a song, carried from village to village, not because he was rich or strong, but because he carried compassion heavier than gold. And Chief Oba, once cursed by his own cruelty, was remembered not for the years he ruled with fear, but for the moment he bent his pride and became human again. Thus the story closed, not with death or punishment, but with transformation, the rarest kind of ending, the kind that turns a house of shadows into a house of light. And when the griots finished their tale, they always ended with the same words. And so, the house that devoured men learned to breathe again, because one young man carried compassion heavier than gold.